Yes, yes, yes. Good evening. How are we doing? Hopefully well. I'm pulling up my live stream right now, so I have all of you online, although it'll be a little bit delayed, so ask your questions. Although I will just admit, kind of confession, I haven't been doing a good job of my phone, so that when you ask questions, I don't see them. So help me tonight. Just say, look at your phone. If I'm not looking at my phone, because there may be questions on there. I'll have it in front of me. Hopefully I'll see them. How are we doing? You have to forgive me. My voice is a little more quiet than normal. I think allergies maybe finally got the best of me. I feel fine, but throat, voice, not throat. Throat is fine. It's not strep throat. It's not sore. You have to like overqualify any sickness now. I promise I don't have a fever. I'm not coughing much. I have full taste and smell. I do have some allergy thing going on with my voice, though. It was way worse yesterday. It's getting much better today. After talking for like an hour tonight, maybe it will get a little worse again before it gets better, but hopefully it's fine by Friday night, which is what I want to talk with you about before we begin. Friday night is our Taking Shape conference, and I am certainly excited about this. I've been working today actually a little bit on the outline and what we're going to be talking about. And if you got the email from Kelsey, then you know, that he struggles with your and your in the title line. He was so upset when he sent that out. He was like, oh. We like proofread the whole thing. Anyways, we can have a little fun with that. You also know, if you read the email, that we're going to be talking about the vision and mission statement of the church, and some, I think, really helpful and exciting changes that reflect not a change of direction, but more clearly what the church has already been doing. And I can't wait to share with you how that unfolded and just how exciting it's going to be for us to provide clarity and direction for everything that we do as a church body. Really, really looking forward to that. That's Friday night. Food is at 6 o'clock. We're going to have street tacos from Tortilleria La Super Sobrosa. Is that right? Did I do that okay? The Spanish, yeah, she was like, okay, yeah, oh, okay, that's good. It's really, really good stuff. We've served it before, so we'll have food at 6 o'clock. 6:30 is worship, and then we'll do our time in here together, and then we will break up into leadership groups. So if you serve somewhere, Bible study, life group, freedom group, youth, kids, host team, worship team, which is media tech team as well. There's a lot of different groups that are going to be meeting and talking about just kind of things that are coming up and things that we want to improve on, things that we want to do better. For the Life Bible Studies, we're going to be talking about Judges, because that's what we're starting on Sunday. It's our new curriculum for the fall and into the spring, more than likely. If you are not in a leadership group, if you don't serve anywhere, and you're there on Friday, June Barker and Jamie Duncan are going to be bringing in everybody else just to kind of talk about different areas. They'll be actually in here, yeah, so you'll remain in here. Just other areas where you can serve if you're not plugged in yet. If you really are like have an aversion to serving, then just loudly before the talk is over with, be like, I need to go to the restroom, and then just go home. And no one will know. The last memory they'll have of you Friday night was that you needed to pee, and then that'll be it, and it'll be fine. But hopefully you don't do that. Hopefully you come and join one of the leadership groups. What are we doing here? Let's get into the Bible. Yeah. We're going to be in 2 Samuel tonight. I do want to say, as just a follow-up, though, that if you haven't signed up for that conference yet, we do need to know if you're coming. We are going to be making some final preparations tomorrow at 2. There is a booth currently right now. If you go out and directly to the left, you can sign up there. You can also sign up with a QR code to take the Shapes test, which is for Saturday, which is the kind of interactive conference part that we're going to be doing Saturday together as well. So a lot of good things happening. If you don't want to do it right now, if you don't want to miss the riveting things that I have to say right now, then wait, and after we are all done, you can go out there and sign up before you leave. And if you have trouble, you can ask questions, all that good stuff. Sound good? All right. Well, it's really great to be here with you. I'm glad I thought about this. One other announcement, really important announcement, actually. Next Wednesday, we will not be in here. We will not be studying the Old Testament. So I want to tell you about something that we're doing, and we don't really have a name for it yet, but the way we designed the setup, it's happening next Wednesday, so I've got to be there one way or the other. Our youth group leadership team has decided to start writing and prepping their own curriculum. The way they were utilizing the curriculum that we had beforehand, there was a lot of problems with it. They were already doing a lot of the legwork already, and so there's not really any extra work that they need to do other than the big outline, which I'm doing for them. So I'm meeting with them once every 2 to 3 weeks, and we're planning a couple months in advance. We have through January already written out, so it's really an exciting thing, I think, for our group. One of the things that came out of this was the idea to try to, expose the youth group to me more, because many of their whole experience in church is through the youth group, and we want them to connect to the rest of the body and the rest of the pastoral staff. And so that was one of the motivating factors for why we're doing what we're doing. Second is we want you to connect more with the youth group, to see what's going on over there, to see how the youth experience is. And so once a month, on Wednesday night, it's going to be the last Wednesday of every month, we will have what we're calling right now Generational Night. That name may change. I don't really know what it will change to. We thought about like Family Night, but we don't want it to be relegated just to the families of the youth. It's an all-church experience. But on those nights, I will be teaching over there. And we're going to be teaching some really fundamental, good stuff. And it's stuff that, for you as an adult, don't think, I don't want to go to that. This is going to be some like cheap youth lesson. It won't be. It'll be really good stuff that will bless you and inspire you and challenge you. And furthermore, allow you to sit with the other students and create, I think, a really cool atmosphere for the church. Just a different kind of approach to what we're doing there. So I will not do every single generational night. I'll do the first 2 or 3 for sure. And then we'll have Brian do one occasionally, and Chris, and of course Aaron, I think is also important to do them so that the rest of our church can see him. But we are really hoping that this thing is an impactful thing. So at least for next Wednesday, we will not be in here, but I will be teaching in the gym. And so I want to formally invite you to come and participate. We're going to be talking about the gospel. And we're going to be talking specifically, that's what they've been talking about all month, but specifically how the gospel has been God's plan since the very beginning. So people have this idea that God had a plan for humanity in a way of doing things throughout the Old Testament, which is what we're studying, but that when Jesus comes, the gospel becomes sort of plan B, right? Like this next thing that God is now deciding to do. And the reality is, when we take a closer examination into Scripture, what we find out is that the gospel has always been God's plan to bring redemption since the fall. And that it is by faith that every person that we talk about in the Old Testament that is with God now in eternity is there not because they obeyed the law or because they did enough sacrifices or because they did whatever. It's because they believed by faith. And that was enough. And so I think it'll be a very compelling, hopefully, and ministering time together. Certainly not as long of a time together. And so I normally go till, again, 8:15. This will not be as long. It'll be a 20, 25-minute time. And then you are welcome to stay. There'll be some other things that you guys can participate in if you'd like. But really, really hope that you'll consider to come to that. I think it'll be a really special thing for our youth group, without question. 2 Samuel. Let's jump in and talk about 2 Samuel. So last time we met, we finished 1 Samuel. And I don't remember, help me remember, did we talk about the death of Saul? I know I read it. He fell on a sword. He was being, backed up by a bunch of Philistines. The battle was waging on. Remember, David had been marching with the Philistines. He had left Saul. He had left the kingdom because Saul kept trying to kill him. Even though David was anointed king, Saul was still acting as the king. No one else was really aware of what was going on. Saul conjures up Samuel by means of a medium or a diviner, depending on what your translations say. Samuel tells him, because you did not listen to the voice of the Lord, the kingdom has been ripped away from you and given to your neighbor David. So in the beginning, when that happens, remember this happens right after he spares Agag, the king of the Amalekites. Samuel tells him, God has ripped the kingdom from you and given it to your neighbor, but we don't know who the neighbor is. Now, we know who the neighbor is because we're reading the narrative, but Saul doesn't know who the neighbor is. When Samuel is brought up from the dead, in this divining moment, it's revealed to Saul. The king is David. The kingdom was ripped away from you, and you have been unlawfully acting in this way for years now, and you will not win this fight against the Philistines. The Philistines will beat you. They will kill you. By tomorrow, you will be dead, and David will be king. And that's where the story kind of ended for us. Saul, in the heat of battle, knowing that he would not win, it says he fell on his sword, thus committing suicide, essentially. Because he did not want to be killed by one of the warring nations. And that brings us to 2 Samuel. Now remember that I mentioned this, I don't remember if it was last week or 2 weeks ago, that 1 and 2 Samuel are not divided up in the original Tanakh, the Jewish Old Testament. Actually, Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings are a two set. It's 1 Kingdoms and 2 Kingdoms. 1 Kingdoms is comprised of what we know as 1 and 2 Samuel. 2 Kingdoms is comprised of what we have as 1 and 2 Kings. They go together in a set, okay? So 2 Samuel is not a new book. It's just continuing right along with the narrative. This is the death of, or David hearing rather, of the death of Saul. It says this, after the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Now remember, just to flash back again, after David departs from the Philistines, remember the king there is like, man, you've been great, you've earned my trust, but the other commanders don't trust you, and so you have to go away. And so David goes, he comes upon an area where the Amalekites had just raided. Both of David's wives were in that raid, so they were kidnapped, a bunch of things were kidnapped, and David tracks them down, kills all of them, and takes back their stuff, okay? It says, after the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, where do you come from? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did it go? Tell me. And he answered, the people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. And then David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? How do you know this? This is big news. Are you sure about this? How do you know? And the young man who told him said, by chance, I happened to be on the Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me, and I answered and said, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Now, understand, this is kind of interesting, right? This is like when you're watching an episode. Imagine for a moment that 1 and 2 Samuel is made into an HBO Max mini-series, right? And like the peak of the battle, at the very end of the episode, Saul with the music playing in slow motion, seeing his son Jonathan dead and all the people, and he falls on a spear, and then it just goes black, and that's the end of the episode. And you're like, whoa, man, Saul's dead, right? You got to wait till next week to see the next episode. And the next episode comes on, and now we have a flashback, and it turns out Saul didn't die. He fell on a spear, and now he's just sitting there waiting to die, but he's not actually dead yet. And he calls to this young boy, hey, come over here and end my misery. And the boy's like, yeah, you're probably not going to live after falling on your spear. And so he puts him out of his misery and takes the crown and the armlet to make sure that this very valuable trinkets are brought back to the right person. I mean, you can just imagine this, right? I mean, it reads like a drama. Yeah.
So you're telling me this guy showed up with Saul's crown and armlet, and David was like, "Are you sure he's dead?"
Well, he didn't see him right away. That's why he asks. He's like, "How do you know?" And he pulls out the bag, oh, right, and tells the story. Yeah. So again, drama. I mean, this is creating drama. Verse 11. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with them. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner and a Amalekite." And David says this, "How is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand and destroy Yahweh's anointed?" And then David called one of the young men and said, "Go and execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." First time yeah. Okay, what does it say? Interesting. Where does it say that? Is that in the commentary? Yeah. So the problem with that is that's not actually clear. And judging by David's response, it seems like actually he did have some part in it. And this is why. So say again. Yeah. So maybe, but not quite the same thing as this. So there's two things going on here. This is one of those stories that I think when you read this for the first time, and again, maybe through a lens that is not as strongly connected to the Old Testament, this feels very weird, very, very strange. Why does David react this way? This seems out of character almost. This seems like something Saul would do. Just kind of out of anger or emotion, have this poor guy killed that was just trying to do the right thing, it seems like. But there are two things about this, actually three things about this, that are crucially important to understanding David's reaction and why actually it makes a lot of sense. Number one, this speaks to the enormity of the Lord's anointed. So David refers to Saul as Yahweh's anointed. He is Yahweh's anointed. Now, so is David at this point, and David is technically king. But Saul, for all of his shortcomings, for all of his sin, for all of his problems, he has been anointed by God. That's a big deal. And so to strike at the Lord's anointed is to minimize the enormity of who this man is. Love him, hate him, whether he's asking or not, it assumes that I am worthy to strike down that which God has anointed. There's a huge imbalance of judgment here. We're actually going to talk, I think in this session here, there's another one of these moments of misjudgment where our perspective becomes, it's sort of revealed that our perspective is wrong based on the way we respond to the events in these passages. To kill the Lord's anointed is a big no-no. Now, yeah, go ahead.
So I thought he was the people's choice.
He was, but God, because God still tells them, Samuel, to anoint him. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, listen, I asked all the questions. It says that David did it because he was like, oh, you went against God, so like David wins. But God took his anointing off of Saul because he just screwed up too many times.
Sure. But it still stands, right? It's still, whether or not Saul is in action or not, he's been anointed by God. Now, there's something else going on here, and this will make a little bit more sense as we talk through it. But that's the first thing. This is a big thing. This is a crucial thing. Here's why. I said this before, but I'll ask in hopes that you remember or maybe need to be reminded. Do you remember what the anointed means? in Hebrew. So it's the same word for the Messiah. Yeah. So the Messiah is the anointed one, the coming anointed one of God. So there's a little bit of typology happening here, a little bit of foreshadowing that's going on here. To strike down God's Messiah is a big no-no. The people of Israel should know this. Now, they do here, but when we get to the New Testament, this is the basis upon which Peter preaches and testifies. It's the basis upon which Stephen preaches and testifies that actually gets him murdered. As he tells them, you have killed the anointed one. This enrages them. I mean, apart from the fact that they're calling Jesus an anointed one, it enrages them that they're being now accused of doing something as vile as killing God's anointed. So it's one of those things that I think culturally we can, if we're not careful, we can miss this. We can miss the cultural significance of this. We're not as in touch with this kind of thing because we don't live in a theocratic monarchy where God has put in place an anointed leader that is literally his representative. So it's a very difficult, different situation and context, and David takes this very seriously. Now, there's two other things going on here, though, that are at play. One of them is called lex talionis. This is the Latin that we get for essentially what we call eye for an eye. So you've heard this before, eye for an eye. It comes out of Exodus 17, verses 15 and 16. So I'll go back and read it. You can follow with me if you want, or trust me that I'm not making this up. Exodus 17, verse 15. It says, "And Moses built an altar and called the name of the Lord." I'm sorry, this is not. Let me back up here for a moment. Lex talionis is dictated somewhere else. Exodus 17:15 brings me to the other point, and so does Deuteronomy 25:17, 19. You can mark both of those. Specifically, the eye for an eye, first of all, let's just go back to this for a minute. The eye for an eye is something that is called upon in the law of Moses. It's very, very clear. If you steal, your hand is cut off, so on and so forth. It's a very harsh and yet, what's the word I'm looking for? Effective means of doing things. Lex talionis is not something that Jesus carries into his teaching. It's one of the things that actually radically reshapes Jewish thought. So Jesus says, that if your neighbor strikes your right cheek, turn your other cheek to him. If your neighbor does this, forgive him. If your neighbor does that, forgive. There's this whole, he's like completely redefining the way that we respond. Lex talionis is not uniquely Jewish. It is an ancient Near Eastern practice that we find in, there's all kinds of ancient law codes. The law of Hammurabi. I can't think of the one that is most closely related to that area, but they all have these kind of lex talionis commands in them. So that's the first thing that's going on. Yeah.
If you want the
Yeah.
passage for that, it's chapter 21, verses 23 to
21, that's correct. Yes. Okay. 21 what?
23 through 27.
So let's see here. So but if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for. Yeah, that's right. That's Exodus 21, 23, and 24, if you want to write that down. I should have included that in my notes. Exodus 17 brings up a second point, though, that is even more at play than even the lex talionis thing. And that is that Israel is commanded to kill every Amalekite. Now, this seems very brutal and very harsh, but there was a historical reason for it. So, if you remember in the Exodus story, we didn't read through it verse by verse, but one of the things that happened in that story is that as they were leaving Egypt, they were attacked by the Amalekite kingdom for going through their territory. And God tells them in Exodus 17, verse 15, actually start in verse 14, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." So this is a point in Jewish history where God is saying, I'm done with the Amalekites. Put them to death. Now, interestingly enough, this also speaks to why when Saul spares Agag, the Amalekite king, God is furious with him. Because God himself has said, I will destroy the Amalekites, and Saul took it upon himself to go, yeah, no we won't. Not a good look. So apart from it being the third strike, it was a pretty big strike because it goes right against what God said. Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19 says something very similar. It says this, let's see here, sorry. Come on. 25:17, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when Yahweh your God has given you rest from all of your enemies around you, and the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Don't forget this, Israel. When you get your land and you come across an Amalekite, you know what to do. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so keep in mind, he doesn't know that David's king at this point. And he doesn't know that, he does. He knows who David is. David's still an important figure, but he's not king. Not in the eyes of the people yet. We're coming to that really soon. Yeah, so you get the idea that this guy maybe was trying to do the right thing. There doesn't really make any, this is why I think he actually does kill him. Because David is convinced he's killed him. Otherwise, it doesn't make as much sense for him to say what he says, which is, your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. That enacts lex talionis. You will pay life for life. On top of that, you're an Amalekite. So really, whether you did or not is irrelevant. We're going to kill you anyways, because God told us to. But it doesn't really make sense why this guy is motivated to do that, other than he really is trying to do, because the Amalekites won the fight. So they're not, I don't know, it's a strange deal. Now keep in mind, the Amalekites are not the ones in this particular battle fighting against Saul and his armies. This is the Philistines that are doing this. But the Amalekites are all in this same, and David's just gotten done killing tons of Amalekites in this other battle. So it's all kind of happening in this similar region. Yeah. What were you going to ask? Oh, after class? I really don't mind. Yeah? Yeah. What verse is this? Okay, so let's read it. Let's see here. But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brothers, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity. When one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed? Shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. Wowzers. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So, okay, now answer or ask your question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this is one of those examples where maybe there's a little bit of an assumption being made on the part of that commentator, because it's not. I'm just interested in what the text tells us. The text indicates that there's no real reason to think that he was making it up. He could still think he's bringing good news. Everyone knew at this point that Saul and David were at odds. David had been on the run. Saul was, news had gotten around. David wasn't with Saul. I mean, there was plenty of that going down. Really, whether he kills him or not, I think is even a little irrelevant. It makes more sense that he did. David seems to be convinced that he does. He's at least enacting lex talionis as a result of it. Maybe if he didn't kill him, he shouldn't bear false witness as well. I mean, there's a lot of little lessons you could learn out of it. Either way, the Amalekite connection is certainly very clear there as well. You're going to ask a question? Yeah. Sword. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. No, it was very public. Yeah. Right. So understand what we're discussing right now is very common in trying to put together biblical narratives, because it's not always clear what was going on behind the scenes and what was motivating individuals to act in certain ways and not in certain ways. And this is a classic example of that. Does this guy kill him, or is he just making it up? There's a couple of problems in my mind with that story, is that they're appealing to two arguments that are actually at odds with one another. So if it's true that he wasn't the one that killed him, as evidenced by the fact that he says a spear and not a sword, then it makes no sense how he ended up with the crown and the armlet. Because if he gets the crown and the armlet off of Saul, then clearly he sees whatever he's laying on. So either he was there and knows what he fell on, knows how he died, and for whatever reason, the same spear here and sword there. I didn't look at the Hebrew. It honestly may be the same word. I can't recall off the top of my head. Either he saw that and was able to take the armlet and the crown off of him, or he wasn't there, and then that begs the question: how did he end up with the crown and the armlet? Who? And furthermore, when the Philistines are at battle, they realize Saul has fallen. I mean, this is kind of what signals the end of the fight. And you're not going to just leave Saul. In fact, they don't leave Saul there. They take his body. So they take his body and cut him up, and they end up going and getting him during that next raid. And so, yeah, these are questions that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, how does he end up with all that stuff if he and think about this. If the public feud between Saul and David is very, very much public affair, he does think he's bringing David good news. He's like, look, the guy who's been trying to spear you constantly, for the last however many years, is gone, and I'm the one that killed him. It's great for you, right? Yeah.
Something I was going to ask about, was he making it up or not? I feel like there are, in most instances that I can think of, in the entire Bible, where someone is speaking out of deceit or someone is lying, it's usually pointed out as such
Yeah.
in the scripture.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess there's not really a question attached to that, just that's what I've noticed.
It's a good observation, yeah. For those of you online, what Josh is saying is that typically when there's someone speaking from deceit, deception, it's usually identified as such in the text. And we don't get that here in this passage. Yeah. It's a great time to look online. Look at you. Nothing yet.
Look at your phone, Derek.
Nothing yet. Awesome. Any other questions? This is good. This is good. This is the critical thought that is really good to put into text as you're reading them. And I want you to hear this from me. This is the reason why I think what I think. I think the Amalekite actually is the one that put Saul out of his misery, as evidenced by the reasons I just gave you. It's not clear. And so you don't just take it from me, read it again, and then read it another time, and develop your own thoughts as well. Yeah. It doesn't. Yeah, it really doesn't. And at the end of the day, that's exactly right. The Amalekite connection is really the big thing to take away from here. But I do think we cannot miss the foreshadowing here as well, the severity of striking down the Lord's anointed. It's a big no-no. You don't typically recover from that one. So, yeah. Right. Yes, that is a great point. So Shirley is making the point for those of you online again that, yeah, there were several moments when Saul attacks David, and David sort of flips the script and now has Saul, the fate of Saul in his hands, and he chooses every time to not kill Saul because he's the Lord's anointed. Yes, that is true. So there's a high respect for this that, is a super important thing to take note of. Yeah. Right. Yeah, no one else, you're exactly right. And he would have been probably criticized for that a little bit. But it didn't matter. You don't kill the Lord's anointed. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Not a doubt about it. You got to remember that much of the Samuel narrative is developing David's character. And what I mean by that is not necessarily he's developing character. It's developing for us. We're able to see David's character more and more clearly and why he is truly the righteous king that God calls and anoints to lead his people. It puts into full view his qualifications. Some of that is because he just has a respect for people and operates in a righteous and just sense. But then on the other hand, he has no problem having people murdered, as evidenced by the passage that we just read. And very violently, I might add. So it's not that David's afraid to engage in war. It's not that David's afraid to have people, knocked off. He's just got a very specific code that he lives by, and happens to be how God has commanded him. Let's look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. After this, David inquired of Yahweh, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. And David said, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. This is interesting, Hebron. If you're in our Life Bible studies, just circle that little word, Hebron. It's going to come up in a couple weeks in Judges. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And when they told David it was the men of Jabesh-Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh-Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul, your Lord, and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. Again, showing respect and kindness. Yeah.
What the heck happened to
Michael.
his first wife,
Right.
who was never mentioned again?
Yes. So,
And now he has two others.
yes, Michael. That's a good question. What happened to Michael? Saul's daughter. Yeah, so interesting turn of events for Michael. And there's a lot of speculation on this. We probably won't cover this. So I'm going to just do my best to shoot from the hip here, which usually doesn't work well. So after the events unfold where Michael he goes and kills the Philistines, 200 foreskins, grim picture. He's given Michael,
Sorry, I'm out.
yeah, no, I didn't sign up for this. Saul actually takes her and gives her to another person. We read last week, I'm pretty sure, the events surrounding the exchange where he gets Michael back. And it says the husband is like going the whole way, like weeping and mourning because his wife's being taken from him. It's really a horrible scenario. Michael is given back to David. There is another narrative coming, actually, I think tonight, where we learn. In fact, yeah, it is. It's coming in for 2 Samuel 6. We're going to hear a little bit more about her there. I'm pretty sure. Is it 2 Samuel 6? Let me just look real quick. And yep, 2 Samuel 6, Michael. But I will say, just as a side note, David has even more wives than these two eventually. He marries a lot of other women. Yeah, don't do it. It's not worth it. Plus it's illegal. There is Jewish tradition. It's not in the scripture, but there's Jewish tradition. It's rabbinic tradition that Michael changes her name, and it's one of the other names of the women listed in another list that does not include Michael. What we find out in 2 Samuel 6 is that she never gives birth. She never prolongs his line. That might be another reason why she's not often mentioned, because she doesn't matter in the grand narrative of David. Sorry, ladies, but that's kind of where we are with this time. You don't matter unless you have kids. It's just the rough reality of this era. So, yeah, that is a little bit of also why you probably don't hear from her, is that she doesn't ever bring his lineage on. Yeah. Okay, so he's anointed over the house of Judah. He's anointed over the house of Judah. Now, remember, there are still other houses. There are still other places. Israel is still the overarching people of God. The kingdoms haven't split yet. We don't have northern, southern kingdoms. That doesn't happen until after David's son Solomon ruins everything. But there are individual distinct houses as well that have kings. And Judah has made David their king. And this is obviously, again, foreshadowing. It should say something to you. The king of Judah, pretty big deal. The anointed one, make the connection, right? Jesus. So he becomes the king of Judah. Now, several things take place in the events between chapters 2 and 5. There's this whole Ishbosheth deal that happens. Saul's son becomes king in his place. And because, again, no one is really aware of David's anointing. This has all been kind of swept under the rug. So even though David is in God's sight, king, Ishbosheth is in the sight of the people, the actual king. Abner, another individual, comes and joins David. Abner is a part of Ishbosheth's regime, and Abner comes and says, hey, I think you're the guy. I think you're the one that should be in charge. You're the one that God has anointed and chosen. Joab comes and murders Abner. I'm gonna very quickly summarize this. Ishbosheth is then again killed. We read that just a moment ago from chapter 4. This is Saul's son. This is why, again, David's reaction to this whole thing is so strong. Ishbosheth is Saul's son. He's not just anybody. You don't kill Saul's son and then brag about it, especially. It's not going to work out well for you. After that, we get to chapter 5. So all this stuff has happened. Chapter 5 rolls around. It says, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And Yahweh said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. And so all of the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before Yahweh, and they anointed King David over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah 33 years. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him go up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater. Why? For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So he becomes king of all of the people. He's anointed as a young boy. He suffers at the hands of his people. He endures much feuding and eventually ascends to the throne. Any questions? Okay. We're going to look at chapter 6. Chapter 6. This is that other story I was talking about, where our perspective is maybe in need of a little bit of retooling, if you will, because our ideas about what is right and what is wrong are sometimes not fully in line with all that God has said. Surprise, I mean, that shouldn't shock you. Look at verse 5. And David and all the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. No bass drum or snare, but we at least have the cymbals going. Maybe it was jazz. Jazz relies heavily on the cymbal. I don't know. What do I know? And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down because of his error, and he died there beside the ark. Okay. David is angry. He's like, why did you do that? And he was just trying to be helpful. So think about the picture here that's being painted, right? They are walking along. They're going about their business. There's some oxen. They have some presumably cart that is carrying the ark of God. Now, if you know anything about the ark of God, if you've read the passages about the ark of God, what you find out, or if you've seen Indiana Jones, you know that you melt like wax, like really bad CGI wax, if you touch the ark. It's an extremely holy thing that you are not to touch. You are not to, there's a lot of reverence and a lot of fear that is cast towards the ark because it is the presence of God. How dare you presume to be worthy to touch such a thing? That's what's going on here. Uzzah has this idea that when the oxen stumbles and the ark is about to fall over on the ground into the mud, that the mud is a far worse and dirtier environment for the ark to fall into than his sinful human hands. So God kills him because God tells his people, do not touch the ark. You see, this is one of those stories that when you read this, you're like, man, it just seems so harsh. Like he was just trying to be helpful. He was just trying to keep the thing from falling over. And I think this presents a very important truth that you can have the right intentions, and if they are based on the wrong moral code or moral understanding or spiritual understanding, bless you 3 times, then it's still wrong. Despite the fact that your intentions may be well, that you might be trying to do the right thing, might be trying to be helpful, God demands obedience, not helpfulness. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of truth to that. Absolutely. There's not a big deal made about that here, so I don't know that it's as much a problem that they're doing it this way, but it does set up this scenario. I mean, this is how you're wired up, right? Like if someone's carrying something and they kind of trip, you just automatically, instinctually, try to go out to save it from falling. It's just poor Uzzah, man, just trying to help. But again, he presumed to touch something that he believed he was worthy to touch. And his hands are far, far more unworthy than the mud. It just requires a little bit of a shift in the way that we think about things, the way that we think about holiness and sinfulness. They're not concepts that are driven into us enough. I'll put it that way. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think these are all intentional reminders to be sure. That the readers are extremely probably shocked. And again, I mean, the people who knew Uzzah, they're asking questions, I'm sure, too. When they roll in with the ark and it's like, hey, what happened to Uzzah? Wasn't he with you guys? Yeah, he died. Well, what happened? Yeah, he touched the ark. And they're like, oh gosh, did he not read that part? Did he not know that he wasn't supposed to do that? Yeah, well, it was kind of falling, and he was trying to be helpful. And he stuck his hands out and melted like wax. It was crazy. So yeah, exactly. If it were me, I mean, I'm just being honest. This is the way I think. If I'm with that crowd and I'm traveling with the ark, there's no way I'm walking near that thing. Because what if I stumble on a rock? Oops, right? I'm melted like wax. We don't want that. To be clear, that he doesn't melt like wax. It was an Indiana Jones joke, and I've carried it way too far. He just dies, is all he. It still is bad, but it doesn't say how. He just strikes him down. Any other questions on this? This happens over and over again, right? We read these stories in the Old Testament, and they kind of shock us a little bit because they seem very extreme. Why? Why does God do? I mean, like the Amalekite situation. Really? Like every single person who is an Amalekite is now dead or should be killed because that one thing that happened like generations ago? And the answer is yes, because this is what God said to do, because they were not God-fearing people who cared about righteousness. They sought to destroy the people of God as he was moving them out of Pharaoh's kingdom. That's evil. It was a willful choice on their part. They're now living dying with the consequences. It's hard. It's harsh. It is what it is. It is what it is. They didn't have to do that. They They didn't have to do the things they did to Israel. They chose to do the things they did to Israel. And the world that we live in demands an understanding that actions create consequences, and this is one of them. It's just a really harsh consequence. And really, the Amalekites had to know that. I mean, it's not like this was news to them. They knew that there was a long-standing feud. I'm sure while battles were waging over the years and decades and centuries, they were made privy to the fact that Israel meant to blot them out of memory. So, I mean, I guess it sounds kind of harsh and kind of callous, but like going back to that Amalekite guy, like, you just got to have the sense to not go to David and not go around to any Israelites. Go somewhere else and live your life and do your thing. I mean, it's not like they were on a mission to go and like wipe all of them out. They just, anytime they were around, they were like, hey, Amalekite, kill him. Get him out of here. I don't know. It's hard.
Saul asked him, who are you? When he told him he was an Amalekite, he let him kill him anyway.
Yeah, again, we're seeing the discrepancies all the way up until the end of his life. Yeah, that's a good observation. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns? We'll stay in chapter 6 and we'll read the Michal narrative. Yeah. And perhaps one of the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Convincing arguments for why Baptists are wrong about dancing. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before Yahweh, and she despised him in her heart. The honeymoon has worn off, am I right? And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, a cake of raisins to each one. And then all the people departed, each to his own house. I mean, this is the feast. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today. I can just hear her attitude, right? Uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. So in case you haven't put the pieces together, David was naked, dancing in the streets. And we say that dancing is wrong. David was a man after his own heart. And David said to Michal, it was before Yahweh who chose me above your father. Ooh, now it's getting personal. And above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this. And I will be abased in your eyes, but by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. You asked. Yikes. So what's going on here? Now, I want to say up front, just as an actual point of seriousness. I've been listening to Norm Macdonald all day. I got to be careful not to just make everything a joke. Not all day, for a little while, for like 30 minutes. This is one of those examples where the Bible describes something that is happening but doesn't necessarily endorse it. Okay. And this is the difference between reading descriptive and prescriptive passages. Just because the Bible is saying something doesn't mean that it's endorsing that behavior. It's simply describing what is going on. Again, no one would make the case that God expects all of his people to kill Amalekites to this day. Right? We read these, again, the countless examples of idolatry in the Old Testament by the people of God. Does that mean God wants us to worship idols? No, it's just describing what was happening in that time. David is dancing for one reason or another, naked, in joy, because the ark has come into the city and he's been made king, and his wife is kind of rightfully upset about it. It's not something you're supposed to do. It's clearly commanded in Scripture. Now, we don't see him being punished for this. We don't see any condemnation for this. So for one reason or another, this was an acceptable thing. But it's not something that, I don't think that Michal's wrong here. I don't think that she is wrong for her questioning David. And I don't think that that last phrase about her not having any kids, it reads almost as if that was like the result of her behavior. I don't think that's what we're supposed to take away from this either. I think this is, again, just a kind of a footnote to say, here's probably why you're not going to hear Michal's name much anymore. Because from this day forward, she doesn't really play a role in David's narrative. Yeah. There is, in rabbinic tradition, apart from the name change, the thought that actually Michal was David's favorite wife and the one that he loved the most. It's just based on tradition. There's no real reason to think that. But that is actually a kind of ongoing thought in ancient Jewish literature. So just kind of a side note there. Kind of interesting. Questions on this one? There's a great David Crowder song that's about this. You know it, don't you? No? Not a big fan of David Crowder? You have a question? Could be. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't outright say that, but I mean, the distinction between Saul and David's households are very clear in these. Yep. Yep. So yeah, you have a very clear distinction happening between each of these men and the way they're being dealt with. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't know that we have to spiritualize it any. I think that you're right. I mean, there is a sense of like transparency or nakedness spiritually, emotionally before God that we're commanded. Honesty, if you want to call it that. I mean, I think the point of this is that David was just this kind of like larger than life individual that would kill people on command for dishonoring people that he felt like demanded more honor and respect, and was a brilliant military leader. And sometimes when he wanted to celebrate, took his clothes off and danced in the street. It's a very he's just a larger than life kind of guy. Huh? Yeah, a streaker. Not a question about it. Maybe this is why Baptists don't like dancing. Interesting. It leads to nakedness. Or does nakedness lead to dancing? I mean, we're not really sure at this point. Which happened first? Who knows? Don't start dancing.
Check your phone, see if you got any naked dancing.
Please.
That doesn't generate discussion. You don't have to look at your phone.
That's true, yeah. That doesn't get something. Okay, let's look at the Davidic covenant, chapter 7. This is a pretty big passage for, things moving forward. Verse 1 of chapter 7. Now when the king lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies. Now that is important. That's the fulfillment passage, right? That's the fulfillment from all the way back to Moses and Joshua. That God would bring ultimate rest from all sides of the kingdom. And that has now happened. The king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go and do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went and have cut off all of your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly from the time that I appointed judges over my people. I will give you rest from all of your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares, that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever, in accordance with all these words and in accordance with the vision Nathan spoke to David. The Davidic covenant. I will make you a house, I will make you a throne, and you will have this throne and this kingdom forever. It will never depart. Now, obviously an important, again, typological thing that is going on here. David is a type of Christ. He is an anointed of God. He has a father-son-like relationship to God. He's anointed, suffers at the hands of his people before he ascends to the throne. He has a relationship with God that is everlasting. These are things that point us to what this ultimate person that will come from David's lineage, by the way, will also possess and will be established forever, and that person is Christ. Which is why David is such a big title for Jesus in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He is the Davidic king, the representative of the people of God, and their shepherd. And there's even sheep-shepherd language in this passage, which is even also kind of amazing. Any other questions on this? Yes. So he goes on, but then that changes again in Kings, where he's given ultimately the green light. And Kings is going to tell us that Solomon is the one who does it. As I mentioned last time, it's actually Chronicles that tells us David more or less procured all the material needed. Yeah. Let's get to Bathsheba. We knew we were going there. Let me just set this up in summary, because I really want to get to a part after this. But most of you are probably familiar with the Bathsheba narrative. David sees her bathing on a rooftop, thinks to himself, I'd kind of like to have children with her. I mean, I don't know how to say that in a PC way. He impregnates her. She's married. Her husband is at war. He brings the husband back and goes through this whole ploy to try to make him sleep with his wife so that no one will know that the baby that she's pregnant with is David's and actually not the husband's. But he's such an honorable man that he sleeps on the couch because he can't sleep with his wife while his men are at battle. And David even tries to get him drunk, and maybe with a little bit of wine, he'll go home and, we can put this whole nightmare behind us. No one has to know. Finally, David's like, okay, fine. You're going to the front lines. And he's killed in action, and he quickly and quietly marries Bathsheba. And Nathan the prophet gets up in his face, and it's a really awesome confrontation. He tells him, this really sad story about a man who has a sheep, and he loves the sheep. It was like a son to him. And he brought him comfort, and he fed him. And then this man came in and killed the sheep, slaughtered him. And David is like, who is this man? And Nathan is like, you are. Ooh, it's good. It's really good. By the way, not to proof text things, but I do think that's a pretty good argument for maintaining household pets and the value of them. just if you want to know my opinion. Seems like what's going on in that story there. So all of this unfolds before David. David repents. Bathsheba gives birth. Just an interesting side note. For those of you who have been around for a long time, you probably don't remember it because it wasn't that good of a sermon, but the second sermon I ever preached, ever, was there's a play, and I'm trying to remember who wrote it. A funny thing happened on the way to the forum. Anyone know that? Funny thing happened on the way. One of you Google it, you'll know. I thought it would be funny to name my sermon after the David and Bathsheba story that I preached on. A funny thing happened on the way to the rooftop. Looking back on it, it was a really big error of judgment. What happened really wasn't funny at all. It was really terrible. But that's in the archive somewhere. If you want to hear really early stages of myself, they're there somewhere. Let's talk about the child, because that's the one that everyone wants to know about. 2 Samuel 12, verses 15b through 23. And the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. Oof. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child. And David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. Let me just say as a side note before I read this passage. This passage is the passage that I read for individuals who are trying to make sense of whether or not children go to heaven or hell when they die. And by children, I mean babies, up to a certain age. And this is a big question, right? Catholics would teach that if the child had not been baptized, they go to hell because they haven't had original sin washed away by baptism. I contend, based on a variety of passages, chiefly this one, that they go to heaven, whether they've been sprinkled by water or not. Because, by the way, water doesn't get rid of your actual sin. Jesus does that. Just as a side note. It says that David fasted and went and lay all night on the ground. Verse 17, and the elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him, the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. And then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. And he went into the house of Yahweh and he worshipped. And then he went into his own house, and when he was asked, they set food before him, and he ate. And then his servant said to him, what is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. And he said, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. Yeah, it's a really amazing passage. David understood something about the reality of what happens when a baby dies. That there is a plea before God through fasting and prayer where there is possibly a chance God hears and graciously heals. But that if that doesn't work out that way, that there is hope to see that child again in heaven. I think that's a really profound passage, and it says something about the heart of God. It's really troubling that at the beginning of that it says that God afflicts the child with sickness. It seems unfair until you get to the end and realize that the child is actually going to be with Jesus, going to be with God. Again, this is one of those things where we could argue about the fairness of it, the humanness, the loss. There's a lot of things in that complex scenario. But the hope, or the silver lining, whatever you want to call it, is that all of the war and death and sin that we find on every page almost of the Old Testament this child does not have to live through. Yeah.
Is there somewhere in the Hebrew text where it like expounds upon that? Because could David not just be saying, "Yeah, I'm going to go to the grave, like this child has gone to the grave, but obviously I can't bring him back to that." Could he not just be saying that I'm going to die as well? And while he was still had the chance to live and live, then I accepted the will of God, and now that he's dead.
Yeah.
And then that last part is just saying life is going closer.
I don't think so, and the reason why is because David writes a lot about the promise of Sheol for the righteous. And we get even in the New Testament the division between the rich man and Lazarus. And so I don't think that it's simply just saying, like, I'm going to end up going to the ground as he does. I think it is really more oriented towards this reunion of sorts in the future. Yeah. It's a good question, though. I mean, that is thinking critically in a way that we should think. Any other questions or thoughts? Mark this verse down. People will ask you, probably from time to time, what happens in this moment? There was a couple here years ago that experienced this, and it was before they were here. They came to our church some years after it happened, but that was one of the questions that they had. And this is a passage that I read to them, and it brings a lot of comfort. God's word has a way of doing that. And this is a really specific, weighty text that applies to a very specific and weighty context. So it's a good one to have written down. Okay, let's do this. We have 4 minutes. I want to start Kings next time. So I'm going to just summarize some things for you. Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom are children of David. So 2 Samuel is interesting. I told you this last time, I think, when I kind of did a little brief introduction to it, that 2 Samuel has kind of two sections to it. The first sections are all about the blessing of God on David's life and the anointing, the elevation of David to this incredible, supremely righteous and just king that God is just showering with blessings. And then the Bathsheba incident takes place. And we see a decline and some consequences from those events affect David's life. The son here in 2 Samuel 12, and then ultimately some of his other children, Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom, who are also kind of affected in some way by David's sexual sin and generational sin. So Amnon and Tamar are brother and sister. Amnon has this very weird Joaquin Phoenix from Gladiator love for his sister and essentially rapes her. Absalom finds out about it and has him murdered. Absalom then departs and then comes back, sets up a coup. David has to flee the kingdom. Absalom is killed, and David spends the remaining years of his life mourning, knowing that, I think, based on some of the things that we read in the end of this book and the final chapters, knowing that some of the things happened as a result of his sin, that he sort of brought this on himself. And it speaks very heavily to the reality that generational sin is a real thing, and that it has real consequences, and that if it's not met head on and dealt with, it can be a very painful experience for everyone. We get to the very end of this, 2 Samuel 22:44. So what we have, we'll go back a little bit, let's see. I'll just read it, because there's a lot here. Context, you can go back and read the whole thing. This is a song that David puts together, the Song of Deliverance. One of the things it says is, "You delivered me from strife with my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses." What's interesting is that David is considered not only the head of Israel, but the head of the nations. that the nations bow to this individual. Now that seems very different, very strange. He's a conqueror. He has peace on every side of the kingdom. And so, it makes sense that people would bow before him in fear because he's David the conqueror. He's a great king, great warrior. But the fact that he's kind of looked at as the head of the nations, or that he sees himself as that, is interesting. It's an interesting choice of words. Now, if you go to Isaiah 55:5, we'll eventually get there in 2 years. You get this. This is actually starting in verse 3. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live. And I will make an everlasting covenant, my steadfast, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and a commander for the peoples. And behold, you shall call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you because of Yahweh your God and the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. This is messianic. This is talking about Christ. You will call a nation that you do not know, and a nation that did not know you will run to you. It will be Israel that rejects you. It will be the Gentiles who believe and come as a result. It's a really cool kind of typological way of ending 2 Samuel. Again, showing the David and Jesus connection. Next week, we will not be in 1 Kings because, again, I will be over next door talking about grace always. That's the name of the sort of lesson, sermon. Hope to see you over there. Ooh, I'm fading out. That was weird. I hope more than anything to see you in 2 nights in this room as we talk about the shape of things at City on a Hill. Final questions? All right. Bless you guys. We'll see you next time.